Paul is probably the most interesting person to make it into the Bible. His story is unique, crazy stuff happened to him, and he said some pretty wild stuff to people who challenge his gospel. But most people don't know a lot of these things that make him interesting. So here's 5 things that you didn't know about Paul. The first is that Paul was actually lifted up into heaven and given heavenly secrets while he was still alive. In 2 Corinthians 2:12-2, Paul says, I know a man in Christ who was caught up into the third heaven 14 years ago. Whether in the body, I don't know. Or whether out of the body, I don't know. God knows. I know such a man, how he was caught up into paradise and heard unspeakable words, which is not lawful for a man to utter. On behalf of such a one, I will boast, but on my own behalf, I will not boast, except in my weakness. So Paul says that he knows a guy that had a heavenly journey, but there is a scholarly consensus that he was actually talking about himself. And this is really interesting because why would he do that? Paul was trying to prove to the Corinthians here that he is a good and reliable apostle because there are some guys who are trying to teach wrong doctrines and say that Paul is a weak man, particularly that he couldn't speak well, which if you didn't know, was a big blow to anyone in the Roman world who wanted to be a teacher. So, Paul had to defend his reputation while still trying to retain his humility. To do that, he tried to argue that even though he doesn't speak well, he is way more knowledgeable than those other guys. And how does he have that knowledge? Because he got it directly from heaven. And to be fair, I think he was actually pretty humble, because he doesn't mention this heavenly journey to anyone else in any of his other letters, and it isn't even mentioned in Acts of the Apostles. He only alludes to it here. But it does explain some other things that he says, because he does claim pretty often in his other letters that he got his knowledge and teaching straight from God, and he wasn't being taught by anyone. He even mentions in Galatians chapter 2 that he went to Jerusalem to talk to the OG disciples to make sure that he wasn't teaching anything wrong. And they said that his gospel was good and only advised him to remember the poor. And he was like, well, I was already eager to do that anyway. So it seems that he really might have gotten his gospel from heavenly revelation. But what he learned there, we'll never know. The second interesting fact about Paul is that he wasn't in one, not two, not three, but 4 shipwrecks in his life as an apostle. Some people might know that in Acts chapter 27, Paul is described as having been in a shipwreck on his way to Rome as a prisoner, bound for trial before Caesar. In the chapter, it said that the ship launched from Adramyttium and sailed for a couple days before the sea became dangerous. Paul prophesied to the crew that the journey would end in disaster, but they didn't listen to him, and a massive storm came that caused the ship to become stranded in the sea. The crew gave up hope, but Paul rallied them, and eventually the ship was lost, but the passengers survived, having swam to land. This account is well known, but many people don't know that in 2 Corinthians 11:25, Paul gives a list of suffering that he had dealt with, and he casually mentions that he was in shipwrecks 3 times. But this letter was written earlier in Paul's life than his imprisonment that sent him to Rome. This means that Paul was shipwrecked 3 times, which he tells the Corinthians, and then later in his life, he was shipwrecked again. The third interesting fact about Paul is that he wrote his letters in a standard Roman format. Paul almost always made his letters with a salutation, and then a thanksgiving, followed by his doctrinal teaching, and then more exhortations and a conclusion. This format corresponds directly to the standard Roman structure of letters. Think of it kind of like today, where the standard way of writing emails is with a greeting, and then the body of text, and then a sign-off. Paul used the formalities of the culture around him when addressing his congregations, and by extension, God used Roman formalities in his divinely inspired letters of the New Testament. It's really interesting to consider that the New Testament and the Old Testament weren't written in vacuums, but contain traces of the surrounding culture. And this is just one of the many ways in which this shines through. The fourth interesting fact is that Paul was not afraid to use words and phrases that were deliberately shocking to his audiences to get his point across. Oftentimes in his letters, Paul got worked up about things like circumcision, or people trying to lead his congregation astray. And on one such occasion, he starts by mentioning all of the merits that he had as a zealous Jew and Pharisee, his heritage, his works, his blamelessness before the law. And then he goes on to say that he counts everything that he had gained as loss, and says that those merits that he had are now dung. Yeah, the word he used here was poop. He counts his previous merits as poop, that he may have no righteousness before God from the law, but through faith in Jesus Christ. Finally, probably the most shocking thing that Paul ever said in his letters. I said before that Paul used a Roman format in most of his letters. Galatians is the exception. Because Paul was so mad when he wrote Galatians that he didn't include a thanksgiving, because I guess he wasn't feeling very thankful when he wrote that. The reason for this is because many of the Galatian Christians were abandoning the gospel and falling into heretical doctrines. A part of the reason for this heresy was people practicing circumcision. Now, if you didn't know, the last thing Paul wants any Christian to do is undergo ritual circumcision. He was not a fan of that. And so in Galatians 5:12 he says, "I wish that those who are disturbing you would castrate themselves." Yeah, that's something that Paul said. He was like, if they're going to teach circumcision, they might as well just cut it all off. Now, I don't know that Paul actually wished that these guys would do that. But like I said earlier, Paul was not afraid to use strong language to get his point across. And he felt that if people got circumcised, then Christ was of no use to them. And as Christ metaphorically said, if your right eye causes you to stumble, pluck it out and throw it away from you. For it is more profitable for you that one of your members should perish than for your whole body to be cast into Gehenna. Paul similarly wished to demonstrate the seriousness of refraining from following the law as a means of justification. So, he said, I hope they castrate themselves. But anyway, thanks for watching the video. If you enjoyed it, please drop a like, subscribe, do a comment. I'd greatly appreciate it. It really helps out with the algorithm. And I hope that you have a blessed day. Thank you.